So the Energy Nerd show is like an interstate gas pipeline, but instead of moving hydrocarbons across hundreds of miles, we just have a pipeline of information. And instead of costing billions of dollars, this show is totally free. Woo!
So, do you know who our guest is today?
I sure do. It's Rachel Wilson.
Rachel is a principal at Synapse and did some really interesting analysis of Dominion and
Duke.
You have some big results, I think, to show for it. Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
Can you summarize the timeline of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and kind of a little bit about what happened when, particularly over the last year or so?
The Atlantic Coast Pipeline was proposed back in 2014. Synapse actually submitted a previous report back in 2016 that examined the need for the ACP and found that Duke and Dominion were able to meet projected gas demand just using existing and planned pipeline expansions as well as storage capacity in the region. The final EIS was approved by FERC and the project moved forward starting in 2017. But because construction took much longer than Dominion had planned, back in June, they actually filed for a new certificate to extend the construction timeline by an additional 2 years. Comments were given by interveners on July 2nd, and Synapse submitted its report, its updated report, again saying that the pipeline was not going to be needed by Duke and Dominion. And in fact, that based on current projections and clean energy requirements and goals in Virginia and North Carolina, less than 10% of the ACP was going to be utilized by these two utilities. And then 3 days later, Dominion and Duke pulled the plug.
I think you have one really interesting graph here that is not unique to this particular utility, but it's something that I think everyone should know about. I mean, what do they do here in this peak demand graph?
So this graph does reflect current trends in the electric industry. Dominion is certainly not alone in its load forecast, but what this graph shows is that Dominion has been progressively revising its load forecast downward. Not necessarily year after year, but there is a trend over this past decade that shows that the load forecast as it is forecast today is much lower than it was back in 2012. And that 2012 load forecast is really what was driving the idea behind the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Dominion has found, over time, if you follow that first year in each of the load forecasts, you'll see that that first year is progressively lower. And Dominion still maintains a similar rate of growth over time, despite lowering its initial year's forecast in each subsequent year.
So they might still be pursuing multi-billion-dollar projects that aren't in fact needed or economic.
That's right. And I think a lot of our clients would suggest that that's certainly true. There is more work to be done, most definitely.
So they were wrong and they tried again and they were wrong. They've been wrong most of the past 8 years. It's obvious that it's impacting their planning, but why aren't they correcting more effectively?
That's a great question. I think the answer is primarily because the thing that drives utility profits and returns to investors are investments in steel in the ground. And a load forecast is one of the primary drivers behind a utility's need to build new capacity. And that new capacity that gets constructed in the future is the way that a utility gets a rate of return on its investment and then passes a profit along to its shareholders.
So they don't make any money by saving money.
That's right.
So during this period where their original load forecast that turned out to be very wrong kept falling, so this is about the need, but there's also an issue around the economics of the project. Can you speak to the cost of the pipeline and the alternatives?
So when Dominion first proposed this project back in 2014, the estimated cost was about $5 billion. And as of July 5th, which was the date that the project had been canceled, the revised cost was now $8 billion. So that's a pretty significant increase from the initial estimate. Dominion attributed much of that to increased litigation that it was having to go through as its permits were challenged in a number of different venues by a number of different stakeholders. However, in our most recent report that examined the need for the pipeline, we found that the cost of renewable alternatives has fallen pretty dramatically since 2014 when the pipeline was first proposed. One of the primary drivers of the pipeline was the increased demand and how that increased electric demand translated to the need for new natural gas capacity in the form of combustion turbines and combined cycle generators. The Atlantic Coast Pipeline was going to deliver the gas to fuel those generators. What Synapse has found is that over time, the price of alternative technologies has fallen substantially, such that the cost of wind, solar, and battery storage technologies is much lower than it was back when the pipeline was first proposed, such that these technologies are able to compete head-to-head on a cost basis with new combustion turbines. And in the next, I would say, 2 to 3 years, we'll be able to compete with new combined cycle units, and pretty soon thereafter with existing combined cycle units.
So how much did the companies actually spend on this project?
I don't actually know how much they've spent, but they attribute at least $3 billion to increased litigation costs.
Wow. Well, they've obviously spent a lot, right? Because it's partially complete.
That's right.
What were the groups in the States that were working on this issue over the last few years?
So there were a number of different environmental nonprofit groups in Virginia and the Carolinas that were working on the project, some consumer type groups, and they were all being championed by the Southern Environmental Law Center, who is a client of Synapse.
It's a shame to see utilities wasting so many billions of dollars on unneeded projects.
That's right. And, one of the things that utilities have to demonstrate in most of their applications that are supporting the development of new infrastructure is that there's a need for such a project. And different jurisdictions define need differently. And some allow for the utilities to come in and demonstrate need without very much data behind their assumptions. And in this case, back in 2014, Dominion's justification for need were that there were going to be a number of coal retirements in the region and that energy demand from consumers was going to increase, but they didn't put very many numbers on it.
The utility shareholders shouldn't put up with this nonsense.
They certainly should not.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you.
Good work.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for watching. This is Energy Nerd Show and Tell.
It's the show that we want to watch, so we're thinking maybe some of you energy nerds want to watch it too. If you do, then tell your friends and subscribe right around here. Click there.
And check
or there or over here.
Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and where else?
And the Energy Nerd website at energynerdshow.com. You can always go there. And if you want to be a guest, you can volunteer to be a guest. We love to have guests. In fact, that's kind of what the show is all about.
Absolutely.